Chapter 1. The Perfect Picture. He said sharing everything was love, so I trusted him with my heart and my bank account. A month later, I woke up to a $25,000 loan I never signed, and a man who called it our future. But when the truth hit the headlines, that same man learned what happens when the woman you underestimate owns every receipt of your betrayal. I first saw him under the soft track lights of a downtown Seattle condo launch in late spring of 2018. The room glossy with glass and chrome and songs that sounded expensive. Ethan Ward moved through that lobby like he had ordered the view himself. People made space without realizing they were doing it. I was there to review a lender package for a client from the bank, and he was there to be admired. He found me near the catering table where I was pretending not to study the cap rate on a brochure. He asked if I believed the city was about to grow another skyline. I said the numbers were not that romantic. He laughed like I had just poured him a better drink. The first weeks felt like a long elevator ride with mirrors on every wall. Rooftop dinners that smelled like cedar smoke and butter. Weekend drives that started with coffee and ended with sunburns and a list of restaurants to try next time. He had a way of making ordinary things look curated. He knew every valet by name, and they knew the exact way he liked his keys handed back. He talked about momentum and leverage and how greatness was logistics done with charm. He asked about my work at the bank and told me I had a mind made for more than spreadsheets. He said belief is the ultimate currency, and he had plenty. When he started asking about my revenue and my bonus structure, it sounded like interest, not intrusion. He framed it as curiosity about how professionals like me navigated ladders with fewer rungs. He said we should open a joint account to streamline life. He said every empire starts with a shared ledger. I had spent years telling other people to separate emotion from money. With him, I told myself this was partnership, not risk. He introduced me to rooms where I did not need introduction. He liked the way my quiet steadied his noise. He would rest a hand on the small of my back when we entered a party and later tell stories that starred him as the hurricane and me as the anchor. On the nights when fatigue curled into my bones, he would say that I was lucky to have a guide to bigger living. He would say he could teach me to stop asking the price of every dream. After a month of living together in his South Lake Union apartment, the first crack sounded like a notification. An email from my bank arrived before sunrise. My credit score had dropped 45 points since the previous week. I sat up so fast the sheet tangled around my legs. There was a new installment loan for $25,000. The signature field on the digital paperwork looked like my name if my hand had forgotten how to write it. I walked to the kitchen and found Ethan squeezing a lemon into a glass like he was auditioning for a commercial. I said there was a loan in my name that I did not sign. He smiled without teeth and said it was a temporary float for a staging package on a property that would close by month end. He said this is what people at our level do. He said, do not make this a thing. He lifted my chin with a finger and told me to trust the process. Trust is a muscle that atrophies in silence. That night, I spread statements across our dining table and watched the math in my life move like furniture I did not remember ordering. Restaurant charges that were never our date nights, car service trips that started when I was still at my desk, transfer memos with vague labels that explained nothing. I could make a spreadsheet sing, but this song was not mine. I called Tracy Nguyen, the only person in my circle who could turn panic into sequence. Tracy had the voice of a person who has never missed a filing deadline. She said to freeze my credit immediately and to file an identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission before breakfast. She said to dispute the loan with the bank and to request the audit trail that showed device and IP at the time of signature. She said to pull my reports from all 3 credit bureaus and to create a folder where nothing was deleted and nothing was guessed. She did not tell me to leave. She told me to document like I was building a bridge. It is strange how quickly you can become a clerk in your own life. I started photographing receipts before they wrinkled. I exported text threads and emailed them to myself with subject lines that would make sense to a stranger. I set up alerts on the joint account and watched small debits parade through like ants. I created a spreadsheet that tracked everything with the kind of precision I used to save for clients who paid for it. I did not tell Ethan that the ledger existed. He kept calling this an investment rhythm. He said liquidity is a mood and ours would improve. He asked me to stop playing detective and start playing teammate. He used words like we and ours when the bill was large, and words like mine when the credit landed. He loved the way a white tablecloth made him feel, and he loved when the server looked to me to settle anything that had zeros. At an industry mixer in Belltown, he fit me into a story about his rise. He used my name like an accessory. He introduced me as his numbers whisperer, and then told a group of agents that I would have stayed in branch purgatory forever if he had not shown me a wider map. When a developer asked if I was on track for vice president at the bank, he answered for me. He said titles are for people who need permission. I began to notice how he handled thank you. If someone praised a sale, he absorbed it. If someone praised me, he redirected it. It is a small thing until it is everything. On the drive home, he accelerated through yellow lights and then told me I had been quiet. I said I was doing inventory. He said that was my problem. The morning the bank confirmed my dispute claim, I printed the case number and taped it inside the notebook where I kept my budget drafts. I felt foolish and also awake. I took my passport and my social security card to a safety deposit box and placed a metal USB along the back wall. Inside that device sat the cold storage wallet I had built slowly since the first year I worked in finance. Every deposit was a little refusal. Every token was proof that I had believed in my own future long before he did. Tracy sent a message after business hours with a line that did not blink. She said the firm where Ethan kept his license was on an internal review calendar for irregular escrow movement. She said none of this meant he was guilty, but all of this meant I should keep my head. She said documentation is not revenge, but it can be rescue. Ethan uncorked a bottle that night and decided to practice a toast for a birthday dinner we were attending for his chief executive. He practiced thanking me for keeping his ledger clean, and then looked over his shoulder to see if I got the joke. He said the room would love a line like that. He said humor disarms envy. I thought about the email that had pulled 45 points out of my life, and decided I would not be the punchline again. We were late to the dinner, and the restaurant made us wait at the bar. He used the mirror behind the bottles to adjust his tie, and then turned to me like a director about to call action. He said he needed me to be on and to smile with my eyes. He said later he would show me a property on Queen Anne with a skyline that could make me forget the month. I did not tell him that I had already memorized the numbers on my credit report, and that nothing on earth makes you forget that kind of math. We left before dessert because he said winners do not linger. Back at the apartment, he threw his jacket over a chair and asked if I had figured out how to relax. I asked if he had figured out how to remove my name from the loan. He asked me why I always had to bring the mood down. I asked him why he always had to confuse access with ownership. He laughed into the kitchen and asked if I wanted tea. In the bathroom, I washed my face and studied the woman in the mirror like she was a client with a deadline. The light was unforgiving, and so was the truth. Somewhere between the rooftop dinners and the joint account, he had turned me into a balance sheet with legs. I could feel a future forming that did not have his name on it. I could feel the burn of fear and the steadier burn of resolve. I dried my hands and let the towel hang straight. I did not know exactly when love had become a mortgage, but I knew exactly what I was about to stop paying for. Chapter 2. The Crack in His Crown. I slept lightly and woke before the sun, the city still fogged in silver. Ethan was already scrolling through his phone at the kitchen island, humming at headlines about a feature Orion Realty had landed in a glossy magazine. He tilted the screen for me to admire his headshot. "Look at that jawline," he said. "They finally captured my good side." I poured coffee and said the camera just told the truth faster. He grinned like I had blessed him. January sharpened his stride. He started most mornings with gym selfies and ended most nights with congratulatory drinks. When he spoke about clients, he spoke about conquest. He said momentum loved men who never slowed down. He asked if I had unfrozen my credit yet so we could be nimble for the next opportunity. I said the freeze would stay until the bank completed their investigation. He sniffed at the word investigation like it was a minor allergy. The invitation to Michael Hayes' birthday dinner arrived on thick cardstock that tried to smell expensive. Ethan held it like a trophy. He said this is where the circle closes and opens again. He said Michael does not invite placeholders. He said we were going to sit with the real rainmakers. I put the card on the counter and said, sitting is not the same as belonging. He laughed and said I always had a poet hiding in my spreadsheets. The restaurant in Belltown had ceilings so high the music felt like weather. Candlelight tried to forgive the prices. Everyone there wore success like a second skin. Michael entered to applause that did not need a cue. Ethan leaned in and said, "Stay close." He wrapped an arm around my waist, as if to tether me to his orbit, and then moved us through a tide of colleagues who smelled like cologne and ambition. Introductions came fast and layered. Ethan introduced me as the woman who tames the numbers. A senior agent patted my shoulder like I was a kid who had solved a school problem. Someone asked if I ever got bored at the bank. Ethan answered before I could breathe and said boredom is what happens when titles grow on trees. I smiled because survival sometimes looks like good manners. The night hitchhiked from toast to toast. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood with a glass held just high enough to signal the room. He thanked Michael for mentoring men who deserve the market. He thanked Orion for teaching him to sell sunrise to people who already owned the morning. Then he turned slightly angled a smile at me and said, as for me, I brought the woman who keeps my ledger honest in every sense. Laughter lifted and scattered, the kind of laughter that sounds friendly while it files away a story. My spine stayed still. I set my napkin on my lap and studied the pattern to keep from looking at faces. The bill arrived as a small leather folder with a number that could have funded a weekend trip. 1,200 before the tip. Ethan patted his pockets with theatrical surprise and whispered that he must have switched jackets. He said, "Can you get this and I will Venmo you when I grab cash at the after party." The server looked at me, because the server always knows who pays. I slid my card across the table and signed my name cleanly. Outside, the air was knifed with winter. Ethan lit up like the city had been waiting for him. He said that line killed and that Michael loves a man who can keep a room loose. I said the room was loose before you spoke. He said I was tense and that tension kills deals. I said jokes at my expense are not strategy. He kissed my forehead like I was being unreasonable and said, "Stop taking everything personally." Back at the apartment, I rinsed makeup from my face and watched my hands find the same steadiness they always found when the numbers mattered. My phone vibrated where I had left it silenced. Tracy's name lit the screen. I stepped into the bedroom with the door half closed and answered. Her voice carried zero drama, which is how I knew the content might have some. She said she had a friend in compliance who mentioned Orion had placed several escrow accounts on a review schedule. She said Ethan's name was not proof of wrongdoing, but it had crossed a preliminary list connected to irregular movement. She asked if I was safe and if our joint account had any transfers without my explicit authorization. I opened the banking app and felt my pulse slow into calculation. Small debits marched in neat lines. Rideshare transactions at hours when I had been at my desk. Boutique charges that matched stores we had walked past but never entered together. A cashiered check request scheduled for Monday morning with a memo that read "Staging float." I told Tracy I was documenting. She said good, and then said one more thing. She said if he pressures you to unfreeze your credit for any reason, send me a text and I will call as the bad cop. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to Ethan in the living room retelling his toast to himself. I took the metal USB from the safe pouch where I kept passports and placed it on the desk. I logged into my cold storage wallet and verified balances that felt less like money and more like a spine. Then I opened the joint account settings and set new alerts that would light my phone if anyone sneezed in that ledger. I initiated a complete transfer of my personal liquid funds into an account Ethan could not see and scheduled the closure of the joint account for the end of the billing cycle so the audit trail would be clean. I changed every password I owned and added two-factor to the last ones that had pretended to be safe. He strolled in with a glass of water and a smile that belonged to mirrors. He asked why I was hunched over my laptop on a night when winners celebrate. I said I was finishing something. He leaned over my shoulder and saw the account screen, his face rearranged like furniture moved by strangers. He asked, "What are you doing?" I said, "I am moving what is mine." He said, "You do not trust me." I said, "Not anymore." He exhaled like a door slamming on a cold day and said, "This is a phase, and that I am making him the villain in a story that only exists in my head." I said, "The numbers are not in my head." He paced and delivered a speech about loyalty and timing and how the market rewards partners who know when to lean in. I let the speech pass through the room without resonance. When he paused, he asked if I had any idea how hard he worked to include me in rooms where I would have been invisible. I said inclusion that requires humiliation is not inclusion. He called me dramatic. I called myself done thinking I could fix what did not want to be honest. 2 days later, we met Michael at a lunch Ethan framed as a victory lap. Michael had the smile of a man who reads balance sheets before breakfast. He shook my hand like he was already bored. He told Ethan he liked agents who could entertain while they educated. Ethan said I was his secret sauce. Michael looked past me to a couple being seated by the window and said, "Results are the only secret that matters." Lunch felt like a quiz I had not signed up to take. Afterward, Ethan dragged me into a boutique nearby and urged me to try on a dress that would photograph well at the next launch. He said image pays for itself. He told the same story 3 different ways, and each time he polished my role into something ornamental. It felt cleaner than any toast. For a while, I pretended the city could rinse the noise out of me. By summer of 2021, the market bent in directions no one could predict. Listings sat, buyers hesitated. The phone that used to ring for Ethan began to nap through afternoons. He said it was a cycle. He said nothing fundamental had changed. Then a client pulled an offer at the last minute, and a second decided to wait until spring. The company trimmed bonuses. The company trimmed again. Pressure turned his voice metallic. He patrolled the apartment like a man who had misplaced the key to himself. When I suggested we sit with the budget, he laughed without warmth and said I was obsessed with small numbers. A week later, Orion cut his commission split, and something in him snapped that did not sound temporary. He took the printed plan I had built for our rent and utilities, and he tore it clean in half, then in quarters, then again, until it looked like confetti for a party no one would attend. He stood in the wreckage of paper and said words that smelled like smoke. He said I had dragged luck out of his life. He said since I moved in, he had been swimming against cinder blocks. The last sentence landed like a stamp. He said I was no one. I did not shout. I picked up the largest piece of the plan and folded it as if it were still useful. I slept in the second bedroom with a suitcase open on the chair. At dawn, the apartment was blue with early light. I placed the keys on the counter and wrote a note on the back of a receipt because the weight of a blank page felt wrong. I told him he was right, that meeting him had been luck for a time, and that leaving would be better luck. I slid the note under his phone and closed the door without looking back at the hallway. In San Francisco, the sky felt like a different material. I rented a small place near Mint Plaza, where the windows rattled when buses turned the corner and the floorboards announced my steps like a friend. Tracy met me with a folder and a thermos of coffee that tasted like resolve. She helped me set up a temporary consultancy agreement and reminded me to file a change of address with every place I cared about and to leave no forwarding with any place I did not. Freelance life started like a whisper and then learned how to speak. I built spreadsheets at my little table and took calls with women who sounded like I used to sound when I still believed the right apology could fix a ledger. Some days I wrote until my eyes blurred, then I walked to the water and let my thoughts find their own pace. Tracy and I spent evenings on video calls clicking through forms with names that make normal people tired. We requested an employer identification number. We drafted a service agreement that made exploitation harder. We created a name that felt like breath after a sprint. Elysian Capital. In June of 2022, the registration confirmation arrived with a stamp that made me smile at a government font. I learned the rhythms of a calendar that I designed. Mornings were for client work and afternoons were for building a framework that other women could follow. I wrote briefs that defined red flags in simple language. I recorded short voice notes to test how the story might sound to someone doing dishes with a phone propped against a mug. None of it was loud. All of it was real. Then Jordan Hale found me. She was 29, with a voice that kept trying to be steady, and a story that was mine in different clothes. Her former boyfriend had talked her out of her savings one careful month at a time. He said it was their future. He said he would make her whole. He left with the money and a suitcase that did not squeak. When she finished telling me, she pressed her lips together like she could keep the rest of the hurt inside with one more try. I asked for her statements and her texts, and the names of any accounts where she had ever seen her name paired with his. We met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, and I drew a simple map on a napkin of what recovery might look like. I told her it would not be fast and it would not be pretty, but it could be done. She cried once without making a sound and then wiped her face and said yes. For the first time since Seattle, I felt the engine of my work catch fire for the right reason. That night, I opened a blank page and typed a title that had been knocking for months: The Cost of His Confidence. I wrote about money that wears romance like a costume. I wrote about signatures that do not belong to the hand holding the pen. I wrote about listening to the part of yourself that knows a ledger is a mirror. I pressed publish with my heart in my throat, and then I made tea and washed a plate and tried not to look at the screen. Within a day, the article found the front page of a forum where women trade the kind of news they wish they did not have. A podcast mentioned it in an episode about financial boundaries. By the end of the second week, my inbox had more pain than I knew what to do with. I created a simple intake form and scheduled time slots, and told the mirror in my bathroom that we would take this one file at a time. I built a short resource list by city with the kind of help that does not judge. I slept well for the first time in a long time. Ethan did not call. Silence is a language, and I became fluent in it. When his name did appear, it was in a forwarded article about Orion reassigning territories and restructuring teams. Tracy texted that the internal review I had been warned about had ripened into something official. She cautioned me to keep my distance and keep my documentation neat. I responded with a picture of the 3 folders that lived in the cloud and on a drive that never left the safe deposit box. In December of 2022, the city wore lights like jewelry. I was leaving a client meeting near Union Square when my phone buzzed with a number I still recognized. Dylan Rhodes had been the kind of colleague who made overtime tolerable back at the bank. He was working in Los Angeles now as a reporter who liked stories about money and the humans who bend it. He said he had read the blog and that it had arms. He said a friend of his named Sienna was building a season of a show about women and wealth that actually felt like women wrote it. He asked if I would take a call. I stood under a line of trees wrapped in white bulbs and watched breath lift from mouths of people carrying shopping bags and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with weather. Sienna introduced herself with a voice that could hold a room without raising itself. She said she wanted to talk about patterns, not villains. She said there is value in hearing the story from the person who had to write a new ending while the old one was still loud. She asked what safety would look like for me. I said safety is honesty with boundaries and no surprises. She said that is exactly how she produces. We set a tentative date after the new year for a pre-interview that would not be used on air. She promised to share questions in advance and to keep any names off the record until lawyers blessed them. When we hung up, I leaned against a marble wall and closed my eyes. The city hummed its December song. Somewhere a saxophone practiced one line until it became a prayer. Back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed Jordan's latest progress. She had closed out the joint account that had been draining her life and set up an automatic transfer into a savings account with a name that made her smile. She had told me she walked past a shop where she used to buy gifts for the man who had turned her into a safety net and felt nothing but air. I emailed her a copy of the next step list and watched the sent notification travel like a small light. I made tea and sat on the floor because sometimes the floor is the only thing that feels honest. The city outside my window kept moving without permission. I thought of my note on Ethan's counter and the way my hand had not shaken when I wrote it. I thought of Tracy and Dylan and Sienna and Jordan, a small constellation of people who did not need to be told how to hold a line. The night did not celebrate and it did not accuse. It simply made room for the next breath. Chapter 4. The Fall of the King. The year turned and the work had a steadier pulse. By January, the invitations shifted from coffee chats to cameras. Sienna's producer called and asked if I could fly to Los Angeles for a live taping. The episode title sat in my inbox like a dare: love, power, and money. I packed a navy dress that made me feel like a verdict and a pair of flats in case the day ran long. On the flight, I outlined answers in a notebook and then closed it because the truth did not need choreography. The studio lived in a brick building near a street with bougainvillea that refused to be quiet. Inside the green room smelled like citrus and new equipment. Sienna walked in with a calm that made people edit their sentences. She hugged me the way people do when they already like who you are on the record. "We will keep it human," she said. "You set the edges. If anything feels unsafe, we step around it." "That works for me," I said. "I am here for patterns, not revenge." She smiled. "Then we are making the same show." We did a short pre-interview in 2 chairs that pretended to be casual. She asked me when money first learned to wear romance in my life. I talked about receipts that told a better story than promises, and the day I taped a case number inside a notebook so my hands would not shake. She did not hurry me. She let quiet do some of the work. We walked onto the set while the studio audience settled. Lights dusted everything with the same fair tone. The band gave us a four-note hello and sat back. Sienna introduced me without adjectives. She said my name and my work and let the room decide its own posture. I breathed like someone who knew that oxygen was not negotiable. Halfway through the first segment, we were talking about how a joint account can be a tool or a leash when a producer in the booth raised a hand. Sienna paused, listening to the voice in her earpiece. Something flickered in her expression, not fear exactly, more like alignment. She turned her tablet slightly and read a line that made the room lean forward. "Breaking," she said softly. "Orion Realty is under federal investigation. The release says the company has entered into a preliminary reform agreement. Michael Hayes is cooperating with authorities on a compliance plan, and several past transactions involving document irregularities are under review." A murmur rolled through the audience like weather. My heart did not spike. It moved to a lower gear and held steady. Sienna looked at me and waited. The cameras felt close enough to borrow breath. "Integrity does not vanish in one night," I said. "It gets sold a little at a time until there is nothing left but a receipt." The audience did not clap. They did something better. They listened. Sienna nodded once and asked how people can protect themselves when they feel the slope under their feet. "Documentation," I said. "Boundaries in writing. Accounts that reflect your name and your choice. If a partner asks you to hurry past the fine print, slow down twice." We went to a short break. In the quiet, Sienna's producer approached with a new page. He whispered and Sienna blinked as if the story had just added a second floor. "Follow-up just hit," she said to me. "The company will make a statement tomorrow about restructuring and a compliance program. There is a note about prioritizing client restitution and bringing in outside advisors." I looked at the page and then at Sienna. "Outside advisors," I said. She gave me a small half smile that said the world likes a circle it can close. The second segment felt like walking through a room I had cleaned myself. We spoke about how women get trained to be polite inside harm, and how finance often rewards confidence over honesty. A woman in the third row asked what leaving looks like when you have a lease and a dog and a doubt. I told her it looks like a plan you make on paper before you make it in the world. My voice did not shake. When the taping ended, the band played us off with a song that knew how to stand politely in a corner. In the hallway, Sienna squeezed my hand. "You were precise and kind," she said. "That combination is rare." "Thank you for keeping the room honest," I said. Back at the hotel, I turned my phone face down and watched the ceiling describe its geometry. I did not feel vindicated. I felt aligned. In the morning, my email had a message from Orion's media office addressed to stakeholders. The company would announce a restructuring and a compliance program overseen by an independent monitor. The message said they were prioritizing transparency and that they intended to rebuild trust. A second email came 2 hours later from Michael Hayes' assistant requesting a meeting to discuss an initiative for women's financial education that would exist outside Orion's sales arm. They wanted Elysian Capital to design and run it. The subject line was plain. "Partnership inquiry." Tracy called from Seattle before I could forward her the notes. "Read the releases," she said. "They are speaking the language we needed them to speak." "I will not be used as a shield," I said. "You will be an audit trail in heels," she said. "We negotiate independence in the contract. We name the lines and we own the curriculum." We sent a counter that afternoon. Elysian would build the framework and control the content for a fund labeled Women and Wealth. Disbursements would be walled off from sales targets. The advisory council would include community voices and someone with a badge. Legal waited all of 40 minutes before accepting the terms with a handful of commas changed. The press conference happened in a room with a cream backdrop and a row of microphones that looked like a picket fence. Michael has the easy charm of a person who can sell a sunrise. Today he used it to apologize. He thanked clients for their patience and apologized for the breach in standards and said specifics would be handled by the agencies involved. He announced the compliance program and the partnership with Elysian. When he said my name, the cameras found me and waited for my version of grace. "I believe in repair that does not ask the harm to forget," I said. "Our work will focus on education and access. We will measure success by how little anyone can take from you without your consent." A reporter asked if my history with an Orion agent posed a conflict. My work is not about personalities, I said. It is about process. The contract reflects that. After the photos, I signed the agreement at a table that had seen too many signatures to be impressed. The pen wrote a clean line. The lights made everything look softer than it felt. Michael leaned over to whisper so the microphones would not mistake logistics for content. We have a lot to rebuild, he said. Then we start with the parts that teach, I said. Somewhere in Los Angeles, at a bar with televisions bolted above the liquor shelf, Ethan watched my face fill a rectangle. He had always loved rectangles that showed him to himself. The Chiron named the initiative and tucked my title under it like a ribbon. A friend clapped him on the shoulder and he did not turn. The broadcast cut to a clip of me shaking Michael's hand and signing the partnership. The bartender muted a basketball game and turned the sound up. My phone buzzed on the ride back to the hotel. Unknown number and a city I knew too well. Then it resolved into the name I had once written on gift tags and bills. Ethan calling. For a beat, the old muscle memory lifted its head. Then it lay down. I watched the screen glow and dim and glow like a thing that needed feeding. I let it ring through twice. My thumb moved without debate. I pressed block and felt nothing dramatic. Only a door closing that should have been closed a long time ago. Upstairs, the room smelled like lavender and new laundry. I kicked off my shoes and stood by the window while Los Angeles tried on her evening. The city can be cruel and it can be kind. Most days it is both. I poured a glass of water and watched the news cycle refresh on a muted television without captions. The story had legs. It walked from site to site and learned new angles. I turned the screen off and stood there long enough to feel my feet again. The day had not asked for victory, and it had not offered revenge. It had given me something else. It had given me a line I could keep. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Owns Her Worth. The next year unfolded without hurry. Growth had its own rhythm, and I had learned to match it. By spring of 2025, the Women in Finance Conference filled the convention center on Howard Street. Banners carried colors I had chosen on a sleepless night months before, the same deep blue that used to make me feel invisible. Now it looked like belonging. I stood backstage with a microphone clipped to my collar and a list of talking points folded in my hand that I no longer needed. When they introduced me, the lights lifted in a way that made it impossible to see faces, only outlines of movement and a low hum of people settling. The first slide on the screen was not a chart or a mission statement. It was a photo of my first business card from the bank, the edges worn and the print slightly faded. The text read, Marissa Cole Consultant. I let it stay there until the room grew quiet enough to hear someone cough in the back row. I said that the hardest thing about numbers is how honest they are. They do not lie for love or status. They tell you what is missing. I told them that I used to think freedom meant earning more than the man beside you, but that real freedom is when no one else can set your price. I talked about the night I froze my credit and the morning I learned that documentation is a kind of prayer. I talked about the women who built Elysian with me and the hundreds of clients who had turned fear into data and data into power. Halfway through the speech, I saw a movement near the side of the stage. My mother stood there in a simple gray coat that looked like every coat she had ever worn to school meetings and graduations. She nodded, not in approval but in recognition. The kind of nod that says, we made it through the noise. I kept speaking because stopping would have broken the air. At the end of the keynote, the host invited questions. A young analyst in the second row asked how you know when it is time to walk away. I said you know because you stop planning how to fix someone else and start planning how to save yourself. The audience did not cheer. They breathed. That sound was better. Applause filled the hall in waves. When it eased, I stepped off the stage and walked toward the curtain. My mother met me halfway and wrapped me in arms that smelled like soap and thyme. She whispered, You do not have to prove anything anymore. You already did. My throat tightened around all the years that had needed that sentence. Jordan Hale appeared with a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. She smiled with the calm of someone who had rebuilt her life from ledgers up. She said the cafe she had dreamed of opening finally turned profit this quarter, and that she had a small scholarship fund for girls who want to study accounting. I said she made the numbers human. She said I made them possible. The flash of cameras caught us both mid-laughter, and the photo ended up on half a dozen blogs before the day was done. By late afternoon, the conference wound down. Volunteers folded banners, tech crews coiled cables, and the echo of voices faded into ordinary noise. I gathered my notes, said goodbye to Sienna, who had come to cover the event for her show, and promised to send her the new resource guide once we finalized it. Outside, the Bay air tasted like salt and light. I drove down Market Street with the windows cracked and traffic slow enough to let thought exist. At the intersection near 10th, I saw the new billboard rise above the rooftops. Elysian Capital, own your worth. The photo showed a group of women standing shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the marina hair, moving with the wind, nothing posed. Below the slogan, a smaller line read, "In partnership with the Orion Compliance Foundation." The image that had once been there years ago, Ethan's smile selling a dream of luxury living, was gone. The metal frame caught the afternoon sun and for a moment looked clean again. I parked near the curb and stepped out. People hurried past, carrying phones and coffee, all of them somewhere else. I stood still long enough to feel the traffic lights change twice. The city noise folded into itself, and I remembered the apartment in Seattle and the note on the counter and how far the distance was between those two silences. I thought about Tracy back in her office preparing another client contract, about Dylan finishing a feature on financial resilience, about Sienna cutting her next episode, about my mother boarding her flight home with the program folded in her purse. Every person a ledger that finally balanced. The evening settled into gold. I got back into the car and let the engine idle while a radio host recapped the conference. My name floated between headlines about markets and policies. I did not turn the volume up. Some stories do not need amplification, they need endurance. Before heading home, I stopped at a red light where the ocean air drifted through the windshield. The city skyline stretched ahead, tall and flawed and trying. I thought of Ethan somewhere, maybe watching another television, another face telling him where integrity had gone. I wished him no harm. The lesson had already been paid for. The light changed, and I pressed the accelerator slow and steady. San Francisco slid by in glass and motion. The billboard disappeared behind me, but the words stayed. He once told me I was lucky to have him. Maybe luck is not something you find in someone else's pocket. Maybe it is what happens when you finally hold your own. If you have ever been underestimated, if someone has tried to measure your worth in their currency, remember this. Your value does not live in their wallet or their praise. It lives in your decisions, your persistence, and your proof. I am living evidence of that truth.